This conference will now be recorded.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, we've still got a minute or two to go, so we'll just wait. We'll wait another 30 seconds or two. Actually, on other news, I also learned that Isaac Newton discovered gravity, came up with the theory of gravity whilst in some sort of government-induced lockdown. I suspect it was to do with the Black Plague or something like that. And someone also told me that William Shakespeare wrote some of his best plays during lockdown, which does beg the question, when you come out of lockdown, what are you personally going to have to show for it? Have you been being creative? If you're anything like my family, we've been connecting once a week, and we've drifted to doing bizarre online quizzes. And I thought we'd try a quiz on this one, in that we've got a huge amount of information to share on today's webinar, some really good stuff. A lot of it is confirmatory of information that we've seen before, but it's still very important to have this confirmation of the findings we've seen. But there's seven actually, key things which I thought, hey, that's new news. So if you want to play a little game over the next 20 minutes or so, see if you can write down the key new substantial facts which I think are worth noting. Right, my clock says it's 31. I shall move this thing so I can see my screen. And off we go. So, welcome to the 8th webinar. This, for those of you who are new to it, is a weekly webinar. We do it twice a day, every Thursday, once for the people on the in Australia and the Middle East, and once for people in Latin America and North America, and the Europeans can join either one. And it provides an update on the discussions that have been going on, mostly on the WhatsApp group, but also via email around COVID-19 and water companies. Every week the numbers are going up, and we've simplified it this week, rather than trying to split out how many are in different places. We've got over 500 people from over 300 organizations coming in from 55 different countries. The key people who joined this week, there was someone from Venezuela, which was the first time we'd had them join, and then also someone from Bhutan. Now, maybe your geography is better than mine, but I actually had to get out an atlas to find out where Bhutan is. It's in the Himalayas. But it's good to have them on the call, and I don't know whether they're on this call or we're on this morning's one, but we welcome everyone who's joining this, whether they're new or have been here for many weeks. We also have different organizations. So we've even got the Dubai police signed up to this call. I'm not quite sure what they're going to take from this, but if you're on the call, we're delighted to have you with us as well. We always start with a sort of infographic of the week, and this is my particular favorite. It shows how we think the pandemic, what the latest thinking is around how the pandemic is going to play out. And I'd summarize it as saying, well, there's three options. There's really bad, quite bad, and just bad. We've either got, we're at the first of numerous peaks which are going to be equivalent in pain and scale, or the second case down here, we're on the first peak, but we've actually got a far worse peak yet to come, which will come once we get to the winter months. Or the bottom, we're in the worst peak, but we need to be bracing ourselves for waves of the virus coming through. It's going to keep coming back until we have herd immunity and a vaccine to help us through it. Now, this sort of picture was unthinkable 2 months ago. Some of you might be aware, I write a blog, and I wrote a story about waves of COVID 2 weeks ago. And actually, I got trolled by a few people who said I was being completely unrealistic and I was being overly negative. And actually, I hate to say I told you so, because it's a miserable story. I'd love to have been wrong, but it does look like we're going to be seeing these waves of the virus coming. Now we move to the agenda. What are we going to cover in the next 20 minutes? Well, there's the usual things, highlights from the week, and then I'm going to go into a bit of detail around the two subgroups, the tech subgroup and the COVID in wastewater subgroup. I've highlighted the water safety plans and the two subgroups because that's where I want to spend most of the time. The rest of it I'm going to go through quite quickly, and there's lots of information on the slides. And of course, as always, these slides will be available. I'll circulate them with the invites to next week's webinar within a few minutes of the end of this session. So let's start with the ASDWA survey. The ASDWA is the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators. And this survey, at broad level, it confirms everything that we'd expected to see. So that's good to see. The difference here is that it's quite extensive. It's 30 utilities filling in a fairly extensive questionnaire. And secondly, it's very focused. It's focused on a particular country, and it's focused specifically on drinking water. So you've got quite a narrow focus on an extent. So you've got depth and focus to it. If we flick to the graphs, and there's a link to all the key graphs there. It's literally a 5-minute read. What it tells us is that 80% of the organizations have seen reductions in their regulatory sampling regimes. So you can see that on that top graph in the top left-hand corner. You can also see that most of the utilities, 22 of the 30 that were tested, have had to change their inspections. They've been able to change the sorts of things they're doing. And some, 8 out of the 30, have actually put in place alternative arrangements for their emergency protocol. So there's a big difference between, or it looks like most people are changing their routine inspections, their routine samplings, they're engaging with their regulators, and they're adapting their business. So they're just taking a bit of pressure off the system to cope with the current situation. It's a good survey. It's useful to see. It gives you a bit of insight that we don't get elsewhere. Now we come to the water safety plans. Now this was a question raised by one of our friends in South Africa, and she basically raised 2 questions. She asked the question, how are water safety plans being used? And when I say water safety plans, I know that in some countries they're called risk management plans. They're interchangeable. How are water safety plans being used? And secondly, what are the lessons being learned from them? We had lots of responses from lots of people all around the world on this. There were a few things that sort of resonated. The first was that the World Health Organization document on water safety plans was referenced multiple times. And the core message within the WHO Water Safety Plan manual is identify your risks, then identify the control measures that will deal with those risks, reassess it, make sure you're reviewing it and reassessing it, and making sure that your control measures are actually addressing the risks, and then reprioritize. Now, there's a key theme that will come out of this over the next 2 minutes as I talk about the water safety plans. It is all about revisiting and reviewing and getting back there quite quickly. Making sure that you've got something that's robust. The other thing to say here is that in Italy, perhaps not surprisingly, they're a bit ahead. You know, they've actually already thought about the pandemic risk. They're ahead because, of course, they caught this situation a month earlier than most of the rest of us did. So they've already done a fairly detailed risk analysis into the pandemic issues and what that might mean for a water safety plan. And on this morning's webinar, I pointed this out and I said, look, there is a document available which actually highlights this, and it's in Italian, but if it was helpful, we'll get that translated into English, and I'll try and share a summary of it. And of course, we were inundated with requests of people saying, yeah, can we get the Italian document? Now, the next bit to feed in is coming to those questions. I've put in this slide and the next slide the detailed responses that were given by Asoka from Yarra Valley Water in Australia, because he's actually gave the most comprehensive answer around how are the water safety plans being used and what are the lessons being learned from them. And if I was to summarize it, he's basically saying that repeating what was in the World Health Organization plan, basically you've got to implement your control measures to manage the risks. And where you can't implement a control measure, what you then need to do is have an emergency response plan. And they have those, certainly in Australia, they have them for bushfires and floods, and we all have them for things like, chemical contamination. So it's about understanding when you're going to activate your emergency response plan. And as before, the lesson here is review, keep going back, keep making sure it's relevant. One of the many bits of sort of TV rubbish I've been watching with my wife over the last few weeks has been Chernobyl. I don't know if anyone's seen this Sky Atlantic Chernobyl series. And basically, you find yourself watching that, which is based on real life events, and it drums home the fact that they had a safety plan that wasn't tested, and that's what then resulted in the catastrophe. And I think there's a key lesson there. If we then move to thinking about the lessons learned from how we're using these water safety plans during this period, the big message here is let's update the safety plans so that they're aligned to the pandemic. Now, this becomes relevant if you go back to that infographic I just shared. If we're going to see waves of this particular virus coming back, we need to be ready for the second, third, fourth wave. And it might be different. It might be more intense because of the winter months or whenever the next wave comes. So let's make sure we've got water safety plans that are pandemic specific. And this is where I think this document from Italy will be a useful starting point. It's a bit like when I shared the document a couple of weeks ago around from Wastewater, their board paper on how they were getting ready for a life post-COVID-19. I suspect this might be a similar document that's got that level of use and value for all of us to learn from. He also makes a point about trying to avoid duplication, make sure you've got a robust business continuity plan without duplicating what you've put for bushfires or floods or chemical contamination. And of course, there's always the issue of review. Keep your plan going up to date. If I now move on, gallop through some of the other issues that were raised, we've got, there was a bit of a debate around business resilience. We called it business resilience through decision intelligence. And I like this point because if you remember, when we started doing these reviews, initially they were all about health and safety and well-being and how did you keep your staff safe and sane when they're working from home. And then it moved to, well, what are the operational constraints of how we get people back to work and some asset management issues and around water usage and how that might change. And then we got to revenue. And now we're actually getting to thinking about, well, what are the long-term implications? How do we keep our business resilient in the future? And what do we need to do for that? And what this document, which is a bit of a sales document from Xylem, but it's an excellent document, is talking about, well, let's take the data that's in the systems and make sure we apply it so that we're getting as much automation and as much digitization of our operations as we can get. Linking on to that, ISLE is hosting a couple of webinars here. There's one on the 4th of June and there's one on the 21st of May on artificial intelligence. We've got this artificial intelligence water group. And actually at that group, we've got a Norwegian utility, VS, and the Intel company are both sort of sharing their perspectives on this. And anyone on this, there's usually a bit of a cost to attend these things, but we said anyone who wants to from this WhatsApp group, if you want to engage on those on either of those webinars, drop Charlotte or myself an email, and we welcome you onto those. There'll be lots of, I think, interesting learning that will come from that. So, using business intelligence to get more resilience. That then, if we flick to the other side of the coin, is around what happens to the disadvantaged communities. And this follows on from a point that came up last week. You might recall I shared or someone had shared the New York Times article, which talked about how COVID was really hitting the poorest in society in North America in particular, who didn't have access to clean water. And that thread's been picked up again this week, with people saying, well, the challenges are very similar between disadvantaged communities in both developed countries and developing countries. There isn't that huge difference. If you're at the bottom of society in either an emerging or a developing or a developed country, you're screwed here. Now, the bit that I take comfort from is this is when some of the IFIs really step up. This is when their value kicks in. And by IFIs, these are the international finance institutions, the likes of the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank and the IFC and the Asian Development Bank. This is when those organizations really come to the fore. They're a bit like firemen. Normally they've always got stuff to do. They're keeping us all safe and rescuing cats from trees and all those sorts of things. But it's in crises like this that those organizations, their value is gold dust. And here you can see the World Bank's done some amazing things. In the last couple of months, they've been able to mobilize programs in 60 countries and are expecting to be active in 100 countries by the end of May. And it's all about helping some of the poorest communities, saving lives, helping the poorest, keeping the jobs and businesses going, and just trying to support the people at the very bottom of society. Now, if that is an area that you're interested in, then we do now have our third WhatsApp subgroup on wash service affordability has been set up. We didn't quite get enough people on it to launch it last week, but we got to, I can't remember the number, about 25 people who are now in that group. And so it's now beginning to go. And if this is an area of interest, then feel free to let Charlotte and myself know, and we'll get you onto that WhatsApp group. My screen's just frozen. Oh no, it's come back again. We've had various.
Yes, you froze.
We lost him, right?
Charlotte, I think it looks like we've lost Piers completely.
Yep.
Is Charlotte still on?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm trying to call him.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Charlotte.
Okay, thank you for ringing me. Okay, so I wonder how many of you are sitting there thinking, well, he's blathering on, but we can't hear him. Can someone just, I've now turned on the sound on my computer.
Yes, the sound is not good. It's very robotic.
Someone just
Can you dial back in with your phone, please?
hear me? Okay, all right. Just give apologies. You can hear me. Can you just tell everybody that I redial in right?
Yes, I can share my screen if you prefer.
Okay, can you hear me now? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
So can you hear me? Now. Charlotte, can you hear me? Hello, Charlotte, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I am truly sorry about that. Technology, eh? Thank heavens I'm not in a technology company. Let me just, as you've probably seen, I think my screen's been shared, and you've probably seen that my computer's just crashed. It's all just fallen over. Let's just go back one slide. Oh no, I'd done temperature sensors. So had I done temperature sensors? Had you heard what I'd said on that?
We can skip through this anyway. The
Get through this.
temperature one.
Okay. Air conditioning. Thank you. Sorry, everybody. Air conditioning systems. This was a question that was raised in the past around how are our what's happening with air conditioning systems. How do you get back into buildings? George Pontin from Scottish Water shared this very practical list of things to do. The one that I most like is actually the third, fourth bullet point down, which is around toilets and flushing toilets. Put the lid down. I've always thought that people should just flush the lid to avoid aerosols being produced. And if one of the things that comes out of COVID-19 is that we all have a better sense of that, that would be a win. We've then got a couple of slides that share some case studies from Canada and then one from Poland. I've put them both in because they're sort of yin and yang of each other. So in Canada, we've got this excellent network from Sandra Cook of the Canadian Water Network. She's outlined what they're doing. They're having these weekly discussions. They're engaging in everything from business continuity planning to comms to looking ahead. And it's clearly a vibrant network, and it's great to have access to the learnings there. You then flick to Poland, where they've got the absolute opposite. They've got no engagement or formal documentation from the regulators or environmental administrators, and the utilities themselves are having to sort of cobble things together and try and run a coffee for utilities session to share their learning. And it's interesting to see that different dynamic between the two different countries. And of course, the issue when you've got something like what they've got in Poland is that, exactly as Beta makes out here, is the small companies are completely screwed here. They really struggle to adapt. They just haven't got the bandwidth to be able to address the outcomes from the pandemic. Now, this neatly leads on to political considerations. This group, you'll note, I've always ignored in all of these webinars making anything that's partisan or political, despite us having various sort of fairly high profile statements from political leaders in Mexico and Brazil and places like that. However, I feel this week we can't ignore the impact that some of the politicians' statements and actions can have. And it's not for me to point the finger at anyone else's government other than my own. And I could talk about how the British government has set up an independent scientific panel that's got political advisors on it who are steering the advice of that, which would, I think, be seen as a fairly political statement to make. But actually, the one I would like to draw on is our own Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, referred earlier this week to there being COVID-19 in the water supply. He did issue a correction, but you always wonder that these things are happening too late. Now, we've got some great organisations here in the UK, like Water UK, who act very quickly to correct these. But we have this issue around politicians saying things that we need to be cognizant of and ready to respond to. And the issue here, I think, comes back to communication and PR. We did propose that maybe there should be a comms subgroup, and there's been a bit of interest in it, but not quite enough. And I think whether we run the comms group, and we're not necessarily the best organisation to run a comms group, I think the industry needs to think a bit more about how it can come together around some of the messaging that needs to be done. That leads us on to the WhatsApp subgroups. We've got 3 now set up. The Technology Solutions Group has 50 members on it. The Wastewater one has 45, and the Wash Service Affordability, that's actually quite a lot today. That was a much lower number when I gave this morning, it's at 31 members. So you can see that these groups are quite active. The WASH one has only just become active, so I'm not going to give any update on where they've come from, but I will take a few minutes on the other 2 groups to share with you where they've been, what they've been talking about. So we've got on the tech group, there's 2 things going on here. One is the Technology Scan project, and the scope for that has grown. It's grown from being just looking at technology solutions to actually reviewing the latest understanding of the transmission mechanisms in water and wastewater. So it's much wider than Technology Scan. There's a bit of an example here on BioBot Analytics as a sort of interesting technology that's been plucked out of that. And then we've got the WhatsApp technology group itself, which is discussing everything from mapping the RNA virus in treatment systems to using technology platforms for visualizing the epidemic. I have on this slide stuck a few, just some examples of some key technologies: Noggin, FebriScan, MyPass, and GoAgua. GoAgua links to some of the things I've already talked about in terms of using data more intelligently to understand your automation of your systems. MyPass is about helping manage people coming back to work. So we've got a really broad range of technologies that fit into different applications. And all I'm trying to do here is give you a very high level flavor of the things that are out there. Moving on to the wastewater subgroup. Now this is all obviously around the issues of COVID-19, specifically in wastewater, and specifically looking at the implications for, do we have a potential early warning method of identifying the pandemic by monitoring what's happening in the wastewater network? Now, before we get to that bit, there's a couple of slides first to deal with the ongoing question. It always comes up: is sewage a COVID-19 transmission risk? And we've touched on this numerous times over the last couple of months, and all the evidence has always been and continues to be that sewage is not a high transmission risk. Obviously, you've got to use appropriate measures when you're dealing with sewage for all good, usual reasons, but there's no reason to believe it's a high transmission risk. We then come to looking at some Spanish experience here. So I'm just going to move something off my screen so I can see it. That's better. And there's a couple of examples here from Spain, from Brazil, and then from Australia. And all of them are looking at similar things around testing for the SARS-CoV-2 RNA, the inactive part of the virus, which we know appears inside, we can monitor inside sewage. What's been telling from this piece of work is that the RNA isn't found in secondary or tertiary treatment or in raw sludge. That's the third bullet point down here. So it's really interesting that even the inactive part of the virus, which we see at the head of the sewage works, gets destroyed as soon as it actually gets into the treatment process. And these findings from Spain, they're consistent with what we've seen elsewhere. It lines up with all our previous learning. It's very reassuring to see. The more data we get from this, the more confident we can be about it. When we come to the Brazilian experience, again, what we've seen there is we're seeing the same thing. There's no direct evidence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus being detected in sewage and that it's infectious or contagious. It's all good, reassuring things. What's quite interesting is that they found the virus present in 31% of their wastewater samples. The bit that I was most excited about when I read this, though, was the Australian experience. And here there was a paper that's been published, and you can see the title: "The first confirmed detection of SARS-CoV-2 in untreated wastewater in Australia, a proof of concept for the wastewater surveillance of COVID-19 in the community." Now, the two really good messages here is one that, well, the most important message I took from this actually was that it's the asymptomatic cases also produce the RNA virus, so that we're also able to spot, even when you've got a healthy population that doesn't appear to be ill, if they are infective, we're able to spot that in their sewage by looking at the RNA part of the virus. If you then drop to the bottom of this slide, you'll see there's the paper from Nature. And this shows the incredibly exciting news that we can detect the virus 3 days after infection. Now, bearing in mind that there's usually a 14-day lag between infection and falling ill, that would suggest that potentially we've got a 10-day window where we might be able to spot whether a community's going into a virus bout and being able to act upon it. And this is incredibly exciting for what it might mean for where we could go with our sampling regimes, gathering the data, and actually applying, finding some focused solutions. Now, you might recall, if you were on last week's call, that I finished by referencing the example that they got in Gothenburg in Sweden. And there has been an article, there's been something published in the Post, in the press, that said there was a sharp increase, a 300-fold increase in the coronavirus in sewage sludge. And I made the statement last week that this was terribly exciting from a scientific point of view, because it would give us, it'll be interesting to see if this huge increase was going to then become a wave of illness. but also terribly tragic, because if that was true, then lots of people were going to get ill and some people would die. What we did this week was we actually spoke to Douglas Lumley from Griab. Griab is the water utility that serves the 7 cities in that part of Sweden, including Gothenburg. And he gave us the full story. Now, the good news is that there hasn't been an outbreak, because the 300-fold increase was a bit of misreporting from the local press. Basically, the Griab utility has had a long-standing relationship with a local university. They've been looking at viruses inside wastewater over the last 15 years, and they had lots of samples from January. So when the virus arrived, they were able to go back to their January samples and reassess them, and they were able to see this huge increase between January and March, or February and March. I think it was early February and March, which wasn't nearly as exciting a story as there's been a huge increase in the last 10 days. Actually, what this conversation did throw out, though, was that they're seeing much lower levels of the usual winter viruses in their analysis. And the thinking here is that probably everyone's now so acutely aware of COVID-19 that just the general level of infections dropped because we're all being much cleaner. He also made the point that there's a higher incidence of infection amongst the poorer parts of the community, where people are trapped in houses with multiple generations, or they're in apartment blocks rather than houses with gardens. And that does go to the statement that politicians love to make about how this virus, it doesn't discriminate, it affects all walks of society. Actually, that's not quite true, is it? This virus will affect the poorest in society more than it affects those that are more privileged. And I think that's something that those of us in the water sector need to keep in mind. Now, the last thing to mention on this deck, and I'm sorry, I do apologize for that little technology blip we had there, is KWR. So KWR is arguably one of the leading laboratories looking at this sewage surveillance looking at the surveillance of SARS-CoV-2 in sewage. They're based in Amsterdam. They're doing lots of work in this area, and there's a couple of slides talking about the work they're doing. What we've agreed is that on this webinar next week, we'll do a bit of a Q&A interview with Dragan Savic, the chief executive of KWR, getting into the data about, well, how difficult is this, and does it really work, and what can we do? What are the next steps to make this real? That's probably from me today. There is the usual sort of links to other shared resources, and at the back of this slide deck, there's all of the data from the previous ones. My very last slide here has the things for you to consider. Please think about whether you want to join any of the subgroups. They're listed there, the 3 that are live or the ones that we're proposing. There is the Digital AI webinar on the 4th of June. There's a technology outreach proposal, and there's next week, we've got the KWR interview. So if you've got any questions you particularly like answered, then let me have them and I'll feed them in. Other than that, thank you for your time. I'll just pause for a second in case anyone's got anything they want to say. I'll have a quick look at the questions, but I wish you a successful day. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Piers.
Thank you, Piers. Very interesting. Thanks. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Piers. Stay safe, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.